Good morning, everyone. Today we'll be discussing the topic of development of diaphragm. Here, the diaphragm refers to thoraco-abdominal diaphragm and also development of the body cavities. They are pleural cavity, pericardial cavity, and peritoneal cavity. The question that is important to concern with today's topic is the development of diaphragm and congenital anomalies related to it. Now let us see what are the body cavities and how the diaphragm separates them and what is the importance of the diaphragm. The body cavities here we are concerned with are the pleural cavity, pericardial cavity and peritoneal cavity. The diaphragm separates the thorax above from the abdomen pelvis below. For the respiratory act to happen properly in the thoracic cavity by the lungs, there is a proper diaphragm supposed to be present. Before studying the development of diaphragm, let us see the clinical aspects related to the diaphragm. In the first diagram, we can see the congenital diaphragmatic hernia, which means to say there is herniation of the contents in the abdomen into the thoracic cavity due to deficiency of the diaphragm. In the diagram on the left side, you can see the Morgagni hernia, which is in the anteromedial aspect of the diaphragm. You can see on the posterolateral aspect, Vogtalic hernia. In the current slide, we can see one other congenital anomaly related to the development of diaphragm, which is called as sliding hiatus hernia. The esophageal opening in the diaphragm allows the esophagus to enter into the abdomen. If the esophageal opening of the diaphragm is too large, then the upper portion of the stomach can slide into the thorax and also come back into the abdomen in relation to the negative pressure created in the thoracic cavity during respiration. This hernia is called as sliding hiatus hernia. Having learned some of the congenital anomalies related to the development of the diaphragm, now let us see how the diaphragm is developed from what embryonic structure. Before going into the development of the diaphragm, we should know the gross anatomy of the diaphragm and various parts of it. This is a diagram as seen from the inferior aspect of the diaphragm. This is the anterior aspect, here is the posterior aspect, this is the right lateral aspect, here is the left lateral aspect. This is the central tendon of the diaphragm. Here is the peripheral muscular portion of the diaphragm. And here are the two pleura of the diaphragm, right crus of the diaphragm, the left crus of the diaphragm. The three openings in the diaphragm, major openings what we see are the aortic opening, the posterior most, esophageal opening in the middle, and anterior most is the inferior vena cava opening. Here we will be studying about an important structure in the developing embryo. This is the sagittal section of the embryo before folding. This is the diagram of sagittal section of the embryo after folding. The structure we need to concentrate here, since we are studying the development of diaphragm, is septum transversum. The septum transversum is the cranial most structure present in the developing embryo before folding of the cranial aspect of the embryo. After folding of the cranial end of the embryo, the septum transversum is placed caudal to the developing heart. This is a diagram of developing embryonic disc as seen from the dorsal aspect. The embryo before folding shows the septum transversum in the cranial most aspect. The pink dotted lines showing the interior of the embryonic disc having the intraembryonic coelom. The parts of the intraembryonic coelom are the primitive pericardial cavity and the primitive peritoneal cavity. They are communicated by a canal called as pericardio-peritoneal canal. Once the two ends of the primitive peritoneal cavities merge together, after the lateral foldings, you get a complete peritoneal cavity to see. Now let us see this diagram, mainly concentrating on the peritoneal cavity, pericardial cavity and the pericardio-peritoneal canals and their relation to the diaphragm. I mean to say the septum transversum. Earlier, the septum transversum was cranial-most aspect, but with the cranial folding of the developing embryo, the septum transversum lies caudal to the pericardial cavity. This is a slide showing the relationship of the septum transversum with the intraembryonic coelom. Here is the cranial aspect of the developing embryo. Here is the caudal aspect of the developing embryo. This is the anterior aspect of developing embryo. This is the posterior aspect of developing embryo. The parts of the intraembryonic coelom are the pericardial cavity, peritoneal cavity, and the communicating channel called as pleuroperitoneal canal. The septum transversum, during this stage of development, it is at the level of pleuroperitoneal canal. From the dorsum, there is development of two folds at the level of pleuroperitoneal canal. The two folds that develop are pleuropericardial fold and pleuroperitoneal fold. Here you can see further development where the folds become membranes. We call it as pericardio-pleural membrane and pleuroperitoneal membrane. The current slide tells you about the embryonic structure and the derivative of it to form the part of diaphragm. The septum transversum cranial part forms the central tendon of the diaphragm. The paired pleuroperitoneal membranes form the small peripheral part of the diaphragm. Dorsal mesentery of esophagus forms the right and left crests of diaphragm together called as crura of the diaphragm. The mesoderm of lateral body wall contributes in the formation of large peripheral part of the diaphragm. This is a slide showing the development of diaphragm from the following embryonic structures. The diagrams depict the transverse sections at the abdominothoracic regions. In diagram A, we can see septum transversum anteriorly. On the lateral aspects, you can see the pleuroperitoneal folds. Here in this diagram, you can see the septum transversum and the pleuroperitoneal folds, which later on forms the membrane and merge with the septum transversum. In the middle aspect, we can see the three openings, that is of the vena cava, esophagus and the aorta. The esophagus is in relation to the posterior abdominal wall by a double fold of peritoneum called as the dorsal mesentery. In diagram C, we can see due to the lateral wall of the thorax being burrowed by the developing pleura and the lung, the mesoderm of the lateral body wall gives a portion to the developing diaphragm. Now the completely diaphragm which is developed has the following embryonic structures which form the adult structures. The central tendon of the diaphragm is given by septum transversum. The small peripheral part at the junction of the tendon with the muscular portion of the diaphragm is given by The pleuroperitoneal membrane, what we can see in the pink color here, is remain here as a small peripheral part called as the developing from the pleuroperitoneal membrane. The burrowed portion of the lateral thoracic wall forms the large peripheral muscular portion of the diaphragm. The dorsal mesentery of the esophagus forms the right and left crust of the diaphragm. In the earlier slide, we have seen development of the diaphragm in a transverse section. Now this is a coronal section of the developing embryo where we can observe the diaphragm developing here. It has the following embryologic components. The septum transverse we can observe here. Lateral to that is the pleuroperitoneal membrane that is developing, and the lung within the pleural cavity is burrowing the lateral thoracic wall. You can observe here. Due to that burrowing, there is a contribution from the lateral thoracic wall in the development of the diaphragm. Having studied earlier the development of the diaphragm, let us see what components, embryonic components, give rise to the diaphragm. Septum transversum cranial part gives rise to the central tendon of the diaphragm. The paired pleuroperitoneal membranes give rise to the small peripheral part of the diaphragm. Dorsal mesentery of esophagus gives rise to the right and left crest of the diaphragm. Mesoderm of the lateral body wall, that is the thoracic wall, gives rise to a large peripheral part of the diaphragm. The diaphragm, the initial stages of development is at the level of the neck. It is supplied by C3, C4 and C5 spinal nerves in the neck region during its development. But due to the elongation of the neck, the shift of the heart to the caudal aspect, the diaphragm also shifts to the abdominothoracic region. But it retains its nerve supply from the cervical region and drags the nerve supply. So the phrenic nerve, which supplies the diaphragm, has a root value of C3, C4, C5. This is because of the embryonic development of the diaphragm initially in the cervical region. Having known how the diaphragm develops from the embryonic structures, if improper development of the diaphragm happens, then what are the congenital anomalies related to it? First one is congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Next is congenital hiatus hernia, retrosternal hernia, then eventration of diaphragm. This diagram you can observe is a diaphragm, but there are the defects here in the posterolateral aspect of the diaphragm. It is mainly due to defective formation of the pleuroperitoneal membranes, which leaves a deficiency, and the contents in the abdomen herniate through this opening into the thoracic cavity. We can observe in this diagram that the small intestine coils through the deficiency here have entered into the thoracic cavity. This is a congenital diaphragmatic hernia due to a deficiency in the posterolateral aspect of the diaphragm. We call it as foramen of Bochtelecke. This defect is called as foramen of Bochtelecke, which leads to congenital diaphragmatic hernia. As explained earlier, congenital hiatus hernia. Since the esophageal opening is larger in the diaphragm, the upper portion of the stomach slides into the thoracic region. Depending upon the pressure in the thorax, in a cyclical manner, it slides into the thorax and into the abdomen. Hence, it is called as sliding hiatus hernia. Due to defective formation of the diaphragm in the anterior aspect, where the diaphragmatic slips are attached to the sternum and the ribs, there may be an opening formed which is called as foramen of Morgagni. This foramen of Morgagni allows the abdominal contents to enter into the thorax. The hernia here is called as retrosternal hernia. Now let us study the development of body cavities. The body cavities development here we are concerned are the pleural cavity, pericardial cavity and the peritoneal cavity. As explained earlier, the intraembryonic coelom within the developing embryo forms the pericardial cavity, peritoneal cavity and their communications by canals called as pericardio-peritoneal canals. The pericardio-peritoneal canals are on either side of the foregut. This is a transverse section. This is a transverse section of the developing embryo where we can see on the dorsum the neural tube and the notochord. Here is the primitive gut, that is the foregut. On either side, what I have shown here called as the pericardio-peritoneal canals. We can see here the pericardio-peritoneal canals. Here will be the developing heart with the pericardial cavity. It's not shown in this diagram, but you can see here the developing heart. Ventral to that is the pericardial cavity. Revision of the intraembryonic coelom developed as described earlier. We can see it comprising of the the cranial pericardial cavity, caudal peritoneal cavity with the communicating pleuroperitoneal canal. The diagram below we can see with the developing lung. You can see here the lung bud into the pleuroperitoneal canal. There appear two folds, one cephalic called as the pleuropericardial fold and the other one is called as pleuroperitoneal fold. This later on forms the membranes called as pleuropericardial membrane and pleuroperitoneal membrane. Due to appearance of these membranes, the intraembryonic coelom now has three portions called as the pericardial cavity, peritoneal cavity and the pleural cavity. Now you can see in the diagram below here, we are having the pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity and below the diaphragm we have the peritoneal cavity. This is a transverse section of the developing embryo. From the foregut, as we have studied earlier in the development of the respiratory system, we see the laryngotracheal diverticulum developing. This laryngotracheal diverticulum gives two lung buds. They invaginate into the primitive pleural cavity which is formed from the pericardio-peritoneal canal. Further invagination of the lung bud into the canal described as the primitive pleural cavity will form a pleural cavity proper. The primitive pericardial cavity is the cephalic most part of the intraembryonic coelom. After the folding of the embryo, the pericardial cavity, that is the primitive pericardial cavity, lies ventral to the developing heart tube. Later on, the heart tube completely gets enclosed within the pericardial cavity. This is the intraembryonic coelom. With the lateral foldings of the embryo, the intraembryonic coelom of the right and left side merge together to form a larger single cavity in the abdominal region called as the peritoneal cavity.